Hello and welcome to the Employee Advocacy and Influence podcast. My name is Lewis Gray. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager here at Disseminate. My co-host, as always, is Elliot Elsley, and our expert guest today is Xandrina Allday. Xandrina is a social media consultant. She's the founder of Allday Marketing, and she's worked with countless organizations to leverage employee-generated content strategies and launch employee advocacy programs. A couple of things you can expect from this conversation before we jump into the full recording. Firstly, we discussed why one size doesn't fit all and why employee advocacy looks different at every organization and why you have to deploy different tactics to ensure your best chances of success. We also covered why words matter with employee advocacy and why it might be best sometimes to abandon the phrase employee advocacy when you're attempting to launch a program internally. So we're not talking about with senior stakeholders or anything along those lines. We're talking about with employees themselves. So Xandrina shares some tips on how you need to communicate employee advocacy to your employees. And then lastly, we touched on the reasons why some people maybe don't feel confident sharing and the tips that Xandrina deploys to get employees active on LinkedIn and to effectively launch employee advocacy programs as a result. So without further ado, let's get into the full recording. Xandrina, firstly, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. But can you just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your role?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I am a very big fan of the podcast, so I'm very honoured to be here today. So I'm Xandrina Allday. I have been working in social media for 10 years now, which is crazy. And I am a social media consultant and I'm the founder of Allday Marketing. So I help businesses from small to large enterprises with all aspects of social media, from full service social media management to social media training and workshops, to content creation, you name it, I do it if it's under the social media umbrella.
I love that. Yeah, thank you for giving us that background. We think we spoke on our initial conversation about employee generated content strategies that you've worked on, employee advocacy and things like that. So I'm excited to dive into that. But before we dive into the how, can you just give us a quick overview of the types of employee advocacy and employee generated content programs that you've worked on?
The programs I've worked on, they have really varied from client to client, mainly because obviously every business is different in terms of how they're set up. So for some businesses, they just want some training in terms of to educate their teams. So it's more their teams are equipped with how to create content and then how to kind of put that out. And they're almost like self-managing rather than it being an official program. I didn't say it at that kind of basic level, all the way to quite established programs where, there is somebody internally who is actually, managing the program, and then they're pushing out content, they're working with the team, they're tracking the analytics, they're reviewing that. And then kind of they've got this kind of circle going on in terms of like performance, just like you see with most social media styles of content. So yeah, from big to small, I've worked across.
I'm glad you've mentioned that because that's something that really stuck with me and something I really wanted to come on to today, because you'd mentioned that you'd built programs for different companies in various different industries. And like you said, they will all encounter different challenges depending on the size of the organization, the industry that they're operating in. But in your experience, what tends to vary the most from one to the next?
Not everybody has the same resources, the same team size, the same budgets. So we're not working from an even playing field when it comes to EGC at all. So, and I think that's one thing that people need to remember is, when they're hearing me supply and they're listening to the podcast, when they're tapping into resources and they want to learn more, it's like we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to other businesses because we're not all set up in the same way.
In my experience with this as well, it's so different depending on what the company even deals in when it comes to UGC. We have some clients that from the outside probably deal in some relatively kind of what's the polite way to put this to these clients, drier topics I'm going to go with, versus those that do more creative things, do more exciting things, have loads of cool pictures and go to cool events and do all the fun stuff like that. Do you find you have to kind of balance that with all of these different clients. Like it's super easy for, you know, a big real estate company that has cool houses or whatever it might be to be able to kind of create UGC. But for those kind of drier businesses, how do you approach that?
I think it's leaning into the personable angle and also not enforcing things on your team. And I've had some of my B2B clients who are what we'd, you know, call potentially on the, you know, dry, that's such a bizarre term, but, you know, the drier content, you know, where it isn't, you know, the super fun, that kind of thing. But everybody's day in the life is different. So we'd had images of everybody's day in the life. So like 4 people, and you've got timestamped, and it showed how different their roles are in the business. And things like that have got the most engagement for these companies on LinkedIn compared to the more corporate campaigns they've got, which is interesting because it comes back to showing that humanized element is actually where you start to then show your personality. And of course, we've got personality as brands because with, you know, there's so many people within our businesses.
Yeah, I guess it does create that kind of like more stat, particularly day in the life of content. I think it's such a good starting point for a lot of businesses that haven't kind of dived into this, because it's just, there's almost a template for it that you can sort of follow, and provided you can get people on board to do it, it's a really nice way to kind of start that process. But yeah, I think you're right. It's the sheer difference in that kind of transparent kind of content that really looks in to these businesses probably makes just such a big leap compared to the, you know, the campaigns that they're running day to day around product launches and technical specs and things like that.
Xandrina, something that you mentioned in our initial conversation was when we were discussing the employee advocacy programs and strategies that you've worked on, you mentioned about the fact that you've used everything from spreadsheets and email as program management tools, which I think is really important to touch on, just because, you know, we obviously at Disseminate, we provide employee advocacy software, but so many of our clients actually start by utilizing spreadsheets in these manual programs. And when I say manual, I mean without dedicated tools like Disseminate. But in your opinion, what are the biggest pros and cons of manual setups?
I guess one of the biggest pros is that accessibility. Again, to going back to those small teams, the ones who haven't got the resources or the budget, it's enabling you to be able to track your metrics and get that proof, right? So that proof of ROI. So when you're speaking to senior stakeholders in your business, and especially if you're in a smaller marketing team and you want to talk about, you know, we're doing this new initiative, this is what we're doing, these are the metrics we're tracking. A lot of companies aren't going to give the budget to a software like yourselves if there isn't that proof. So using something like a Google Sheet, an Excel sheet to just start, and that can be, again, for your metrics, but it also can be where you have a content hub. So that could be where you're putting your content, creating your content, and sharing it with your wider team too. So it's both sides of the coin. Like, it's not just necessary for the metrics, which is obviously a very important part of the puzzle, but also for that, you know, content sharing place. But also, like you mentioned, I've used email, Slack, Team, Channel 2 for content distribution specifically, depending on the business, depends on where their main communication channel lies. So we often find that whatever the course of, you know, their preferred method of communication is, that's actually the easiest place to then distribute content, because that's where people are anyway. And then if they're having content provided to them in whatever way that looked, then they're more likely to be responsive and actually do something with it, rather than putting it in, say, for example, in a Google Sheet where they're not likely to check unless you're prompting them. It's actually sometimes easier to do it that way, even if it does mean that the person who's managing the program does have a little bit more work in terms of they've got to share things more frequently, perhaps. You also said, but what are the cons? And the cons, obviously, on the flip side are you don't just then have one plate for everything, whether that be the content and the analytics, and also you do have to really have somebody who is dedicated to managing this, because otherwise, there could be many different stakeholders involved, and there needs to be that key, point person who's managing this program, even in the early, small stage foundations. So with that, I think, again, it can sometimes give them more work because, they're kind of managing different placements for the program. But again, I do think it's often the case where we have to start more. So as long as they know what their goal is and where they're going with it, then overall it is a pro, but obviously it could lead to more work in the short term.
You mentioned scale early on. Do you find there's a tipping point where, actually, do you know what, we need some dedicated tooling for this? We need something to kind of help us manage this? Or do you think actually is different per business when that kind of kicks in?
I think it is probably different for every business, because every business, again, it is so different. I think a lot of companies, from my experience, with all kind of social tools, marketing tools, a lot of them often get reviewed around the time the budget gets reviewed. So depending on where your year runs, whether it's a calendar year from January to December, if it's the tax financial year from May to April, or something else completely, a lot of the time it's when people are getting that pop and they're like, okay, let's review what tools we're using. Are we happy with them? Are we not? Is there anything we want to introduce? Is there anything we can scale back on? Should we do a comparison? And I think often it's at that point where obviously if they've got the proof as well, so they've been doing it for a while and the stakeholders are happy, because there's also that point, I think having enough proof, because it's always about justifying kind of what's next in the project, and should we continue with it? Is it worth our effort? So it's the combined factor. I think it's whenever the budget's probably going to be reviewed, and then also if you've got enough proof at that point when the budget's being looked at.
Yeah, that's a valid way of looking at it. And I think probably a big indicator for people to like force the scale point as well, to get actually, you know what, next year we've got some money, let's put a lot more energy and effort into this and really try and scale it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I know that with my clients and things that I've also worked on in the past, is there's situations where that that's coming up. So it's worthwhile making sure you've got enough of, those analytics, so you can sit down and you can kind of showcase your work. And because not everybody in the business, depending on the size of the business, not necessarily the people who make the decisions might have seen all of this good work you've done. So your manager might be aware of how successful the program, but perhaps, the people who are making the financial decisions and who are signing off on this, maybe they don't know, all the good work you've been doing. So you essentially then need to, put your case forward and say, this is why we want it. This is what we've done so far. So if you almost know when your company has got the budget, you're pitching before that point comes, so that you can then allocate those funds. So I think that's the way that I've always worked in terms of just planning. It's good to plan. It's good to always have a goal. I think having timelines and goals is always important with anything that you're starting, any kind of campaign, and this is no different. So setting those goals for your EGC program as a whole, whether that be, we want to get, new candidates for some vacancies, or whether it be literally let's get a budget for a tool so that we can amplify the program further.
Yeah, and it's just having those proof points like ready to go, isn't it? This is the endless challenge that you see. We see with prospects that are looking to onboard our tool and things like that. If you go last minute to senior stakeholders and budget holders and say, "Hey, we want all this money," and you don't have evidence to it, it's as much harder to sell, right? Because a lot of people just don't think about it. They're not in that social media space. They don't really understand the impact of these things. Whereas if you can go, look, we've been doing this for 6 months. This are the results. We think actually if we triple our efforts and resource into this, we can 6x the output on the other side. That's what people really want to be able to hear. But you need the evidence, you need the anecdotes, you need the data to be able to ever get there. Otherwise, you're running against a brick wall typically.
Well, Xandrina, whether it's a employee-generated content strategy or if you're managing a scale employee advocacy program, obviously this is nothing without employee buy-in. And this is something that really stuck with me after our initial conversation, because something that we've spoken about a lot recently is the terminology around employee advocacy. Because obviously it means something to organizations. So for us as Disseminate, it means something to our buyers. But when organizations are communicating this to their employees and when they're trying to get an advocacy program off the ground, calling it an employee advocacy platform might not resonate with somebody who's maybe focused on building their personal brand. So we've seen a lot of companies have different names for this. It could be a company sharing initiative or something along those lines. But we mentioned that teams will actively avoid the phrase employee advocacy. So I've kind of alluded to my suspicions as to why that might be, but why do you think that is in your experience?
If people aren't sure what it is, they might then want to stray away from it. So I think how you label what your program looks like internally could be very different from one company to the next. And I think that's absolutely fine. You know, in the broad term for us talking about it in the industry, calling it the same thing, I think is useful because we're all then working from the same, point. But in internal organizations, if you want to call it your ambassadors or your employee advocacy program, or if you just want to call it the personal branding program or, team content, it's essentially the same thing, whatever it's called. But if it makes people in your organization feel comfortable from both a stakeholder perspective, but also the people who are going to be creating content. So if it makes them feel more inclined to create content and to share content, then that's only a good thing, because language is so important in all aspects of marketing, right? And this is no different. You want buy-in from your team to partake in this. So the language and the phrase that you use to then promote this internally to get people to take part, I'd actually argue it's probably the most important thing, because if you don't get that right, as well as obviously the education piece, and people aren't going to help you with it, and then you're not going to get it off the ground. So actually thinking of what you're going to call that program internally is a great starting point, whether it's going to be a success or not, really.
We have this from a technology standpoint, the similar kind of challenge on a different element from a tech perspective, which is we really don't like it actually if people use disseminate. Now, I'm speaking from my perspective in kind of customer side of things. Our marketing team would much prefer it if everybody called it disseminate, for obvious reasons. We want that name in as many places as possible. But from our side of things, to your point, we don't want people signing up for just another bit of software. Oh, here's another thing that I need to log into on a given day. So, within Disseminate as a platform, you can rename the entire thing and kind of give it that identity. And we've massively push all of our clients to do that. But to your exact point, people don't want to join Disseminate, the employee advocacy platform. People want to join for use of certain clients that we can name and such, but like Nissan insiders and things like that. Those are the things that people want to be able to join, something that makes them feel part of a community, part of something that is they're being invited to. It's a little bit more exclusive from that perspective. I think it makes, just to your point, such a big difference from a comms perspective when you're asking people to join, an internal community that's built for them to encourage things for them, as opposed to, hey, we'd like more marketing visibility, please start sharing all of our content, essentially.
I think there's something to be said about making it exclusive as well, Xandrina. You kind of touched on this when you give it a unique identity. And I don't know if you saw the example of Barclays recently with their employee generated content strategy, where they rolled out the Barclays Creator Club, but they sent their employees the people who had been selected to participate, they put their own names forward, but then they were able to kind of cherry pick because they had a long list of people who wanted to participate. But they sent them like a creators pack. They included a branded cap. They got a few content creation tools like a ring light and stuff like that. But I thought it was a really nice way to kind of not only empower them, but to give it its identity, and it creates this element of exclusivity, because naturally these people posted that welcome pack on LinkedIn, and then that led to other employees at Barclays then wanting to do the same, and it kind of snowballed from there. So I think it's I don't know, I think it's beneficial for more than one reason, because it can kind of help you scale as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's fantastic. I hadn't seen that example, but I absolutely love it, and I think that's fantastic that they've done that. And I think it makes people feel valued as well from the get-go, which is also really important when people are joining something new and they're taking initiative themselves. So if in the scheme of things, relatively, that sounds like that wouldn't cost the business that much money.
To be honest, one thing that I'm now thinking about as well is that something I don't see a huge amount of anymore, and I'm wondering whether it's time for it to make a comeback. You used to see an enormous amount of new joiners posting company laptop and a load of swag and merch, and that was like a big LinkedIn push that everyone was doing all the time. maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see that content a huge amount anymore on LinkedIn. I'm intrigued as to whether that's fallen off, and it's probably actually a very, very easy route into that kind of UGC content for people, which is here's your company laptop and a load of swag and merch for the business. Please post it onto LinkedIn. Is probably quite a good starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's an easy one, isn't it? I guess the difficult one is if people are getting that merch when they're joining the company, they might not, unless they are literally given this information, being like, this is our program, it's very established, and we'd love you to join it. I don't know how comfortable people would feel about straight away being like, I've joined this company, here's this. But then there are other people that would. So it really does depend on the person ultimately. But as I'd say, again, that comes down to empowering the team so they know what they not giving them complete saying you can't do this, but just giving them some guidance so they feel confident that they can post. Because there was a time, and I remember, in 10 plus years ago, before I started working in social media, there was a time where employees shouldn't be seen or heard on social media. So there's also that archaic narrative of that we're now rewriting, 10 plus years on, and we're trying to get more people to be our employee ambassadors, to be, the faces of our business, to create content. But there was once a time where employees were told, do not say anything good or bad about the company on social media, full stop. So the people who remember that and who are part of company back then, it's also rewriting that narrative and being given the green light. So knowing if you've been on both sides of the coin, it's knowing how to then pivot and being given the information to be able to feel confident in doing so.
Yeah, I think part of the empowerment mission starts with just having a clear social media policy as well. It's something that we've discussed on this podcast quite a lot. Obviously, it's, if you're launching an employee advocacy program, it's something you want to have in place regardless. But even if you're thinking about leveraging employee generated content or trying to encourage that, if, as you've said, Xandrina, employees don't know what is and isn't okay to post, they won't. And if, there's going to be people in the workforce who will remember the time when posting about your employer on social media was a big no-no. Like you said, it would get you in, worst case scenario, you could end up losing your job as a result, depending on what you said. But it was seriously discouraged. So we do actually have we'll link to this in the show notes, but we put together a social media policy template a while back for this reason. And it shouldn't be this big, complicated document. It can just be, obviously depending on the industry, but it can just be 1 to 2 pages of clear guidelines of please do this, please don't do this, but please do post on social media because, we want you to do it. And I think just coming back to the Barclays example, giving people the means and really giving them the tools to go and create is as much empowerment as you need. It's not just saying this is okay, it's saying this is encouraged and here's how to do it well. But empowerment is something that I'm glad we've touched on, Xandrina, because I know that you run personal branding workshops. It's something that you'll help employees with, is kind of taking their first steps to posting on LinkedIn and, just social media in general. But in your experience, what's the biggest fear that people have about posting? Or alternatively, what's the number one reason that they don't?
Yeah, the biggest thing that I see when I'm running workshops and webinars on personal branding is that people are just, they're scared to kind of be on camera. That's kind of the biggest one, or they're scared to just put content out there, not even just be on camera. It's a scary concept to some people. And I often say just start small, even if it's starting with comments, right? So if we're thinking about LinkedIn specifically, there's many different platforms and there's so many different ways to do this. So it's not to say that LinkedIn's the only platform, but if we're giving LinkedIn as an example, start in the comments, start engaging with people on other people's posts, and start, actually saying something that you're interested in or share something that and be part of a conversation. Because then once you've gained confidence having conversations with other people under other people's posts, and suddenly you'll have more confidence to actually show up and then host your own conversation in the form of a post. And then that could just be, with an image. It could just be a text only post. It doesn't have to have a video. And then obviously, again, once you've gained confidence with that, you might think, okay, I might start putting some images of myself on there. And then it might then lead to a video. So I think it's start small, it's all steps in the right direction. and everyone's coming in at a different entry point. Nobody has had the same experience. Nobody's got the same skill set and confidence levels when it comes to these things. So don't put the pressure that you need to be perfect and you've got to be on video from day one, because that's not the case. And actually going on to the perfection thing, I think a lot of people wait to be perfect when it comes to content, especially video content. The people get scared of showing up and going on and saying the wrong thing. But nobody's perfect on day one. And if you strive for perfection, you'll never get there, which is one of those cliche things. So when it comes to content, it's so true. The only way to improve is by doing it. And I've even given the advice to some of my clients, if video yourself a few times, don't actually post it, but get used to talking to camera, just even a few times, like setting it up yourself. And then once you've kind of done it a few times, then just hit post, because there's nothing going to be scarier than your first time. And then once you're past that, again, you're going to feel a bit better each time. And yeah, and then you'll grow from there. But again, no one's an expert. So I think it's just pushing past those fears, and nothing changes if you remain the same. So on the other side of fear is growth, and good things happen when you post content, as we're in the age where content is king.
Can relate to so many of those fears as well in my own right. I think one of the early things I used to have to get used to was hearing my own voice, particularly when it came to videos, like even doing the podcast and things like that. Like, listening back to yourself, it's always the most uncomfortable thing. Nobody else thinks it when they're watching these things, but when you listen to yourself, it's always like a sort of tension moment. So that has always been a piece of recommendation that I've given to people. It's just like, don't watch it back. Just post it. You'll know if you've messed it up, because you just will want to re-record it, but just post it. Don't watch it back about yourself, and you'll get over it pretty quickly. And then over time, with the podcast and things like that, I've got very used to it, but it does take a little bit for people to kind of get into that process, I think.
One thing I have said before is that, and this is on a slightly different topic, but it's relevant for all social media, is nobody's thinking about you as much as you're thinking about yourself, which is super true, right? Nobody criticizes or, complains about themselves as much as, you think about yourself in every aspect, good and bad, more than anyone else. And by extension, as your company as well. So if you're a business owner, or even if you work for a company, nobody's thinking about your business as much as you are. So it's like, yes, you've got to put yourself out there, but also don't be so hypercritical of yourself, because nobody's concerned about, the minor details like you are about those things, because, they're so interested in themselves, and you've got to make them fundamentally interested in what you're doing. But they're not looking at, have you got lipstick on or not? And they're not looking at, what colours your walls behind you and thinking, oh, it should be a slightly different shade, shouldn't it? Like, they don't care. I mean, thinking more about them than they are you. So just go for it.
And I think that's so much the case as well with people that are new to this, right? I think potentially older, more senior individuals, they tend to not worry so much about what everyone's thinking. The social media element is the complicated part for them, right? It's like just physically how to post, like what's the process. Mm-hmm. They're unsure around the practicalities of it more than they are what to say and how to present themselves. I think it's the complete inverse for kind of more junior or younger people that are kind of coming into this space. They're really unsure about like what to say, and they're conscious about how they present. The posting to social media, the creating the content, they consume so much of it, it makes sense. It's really, really easy to do. It's just these two separate things as well that people have to deal with in different ways, that you have to kind of police that almost.
Xandrina, I'll ask you the big question, because this is one that everybody wants to know the answer to, because like you've alluded to at the beginning of the episode, every organization will do this differently. They will, have different definitions of employee advocacy. They'll encounter different challenges, but most importantly, everybody has a different definition of success. But can you just walk us through how you measure success and then demonstrate the business impact from employee-generated content strategies?
I think, again, people need to remember that the success for personal branding, for employee-generated content, employee advocacy, it looks different for everybody. So from one business to the next, it's going to be fundamentally different. And I'll share with you something that I say to everybody when I'm talking about personal branding is personal branding is like compound interest. So it builds over time. You're not going to see results on day one, which I think is really important for people to remember. And even, you might not see, if you're in sales and say you start to post, you're like, well, why am I not getting any leads? It's not going to happen instantaneously. You need to build that social proof. You need to build that trust, the credibility, and it will happen in time. But it is making those incremental those incremental investments essentially into what you're building here. And that's what it builds up to. But in terms of specific results, people might be looking to get more candidates kind of applying for their vacancies. They might be looking for, leads for their business. They might be looking for just more views on videos, for example. They might be hoping to get more website traffic. It's everybody has got such different goals essentially, and that's from an individual and a business perspective too, because people can have different goals for both. So I think it's thinking about the whole funnels, going back to the basics like the marketing funnel, awareness, consideration and purchase. Where are you trying to align? But again, remembering that this takes time. So fundamentally you are at the awareness stage. Doesn't mean you can't get to those conversions later on, but it's not going to happen overnight. So it's really about having content that kind of goes at all points of the funnel throughout your program that then will produce the results that you want, but also being realistic with it and knowing that, with all social media, it's about, the long-term game. Social media is, marketing at scale. So that's what we're doing here. And then in terms of business impact, honestly, it's one of the best things that I think you can do for your business is to empower your employees to, be a part of something, be a part of this community, create content, share their experiences. It's only going to benefit both of you. You can generate revenue, you can bring in leads to your business, traffic awareness, you can bring new candidates to your business. The list just goes on of what is possible. So I would say, especially as we're going into we'll be going into 2026 soon. People are going to be planning for their marketing. They're going to be looking at their marketing budgets, thinking, where should I be spending my time? And I think we're going to see even more, personalization, humanizing of content and, community-based marketing, and all of these things come back to creating things like employee, generated content and employee advocacy programs.
I think you made such a valid point there with ultimately this can only be a benefit for businesses, which is like such a simple way of looking at it in the grand scheme of things. But it is just like, what are the negatives that come from this? The best case scenario is you make loads more money because all your employees are sharing. But the worst case scenario is people know who you are a little bit more. Like that's the worst thing that's going to come out of this is you get a bit more visibility, which is always going to be a good thing. But you're so right from a perspective of the benefits. There's just so many different areas of a business that this has an impact on, but it's not overnight. You have to grow this. You have to build this. You have to kind of work on it over time for it to start paying dividends over time as well. And without that and trying to run this as a 2-month pilot system that you'll review and maybe come back to next year, you're just not really going to see the benefits from it. You want to run this as an initiative and as a project, I think.
Well, Xandrina, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your insights and your experiences as well, because I think there's plenty of takeaways here for our listeners to consider, especially if you're managing an employee-generated content strategy. Some absolute gold in here. So we'll link to any resources that we've mentioned in the show notes as well. But Xandrina, you've given us so much, so the floor is yours now. Do you want to just tell our listeners a little bit about what you're working on right now and where they can follow your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again, God. I've literally loved this conversation. I've had so much fun today, and hopefully it will open more people's eyes about, the possibilities and what is possible in terms of building out their program. But yeah, in terms of kind of keeping up with me, what I'm doing, you can follow me on LinkedIn, Xandrina Allday. And you can also go to my website, learn more about what I do in social media. Like I said, I offer solutions for all size businesses all across social media, including workshops on topics like personal branding and EGC. So if people are looking to develop further, you can give kind of that personalized guidance, and you can go to my website, which is alldaymarketing.co.uk. And I also have a new blog on there, which I'm releasing every Wednesday. There'll be a new one, and that's under the All Day Edit. So yeah, a lot more from me on there.
So definitely check it out. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everybody for listening. We'll see you next week.